course, they never came out that night, and the family members were starting to wonder where their kids were. It's not a very populated area up there, so it's more of almost country and kind of farming fields, as you can imagine. So the word kind of took a while, but the parents quickly realized, all right, hey, after making phone calls, that the other sons weren't home. So they end up going to the cave. A lot of them didn't tell their parents they went to the cave because they thought they might say no. So they initially started looking at places they could be, and they knew that the cave might be one of them, and that's when they found their bicycles and chained up to this little rail near the front of the cave, and of course they assumed the worst. So the very next day, kind of a call for help goes out, but it's just locally. The local search and rescue teams from MSgt and civilian volunteers respond. They don't have a ton of training. They're just kind of like first responders, and they didn't really know what was going on yet, and the cave wasn't wet yet at this point to where they were. So as I'll talk about a little bit later, you guys will see kind of as it flooded, the different parts that flooded first that trapped them in. But when the initial rescuers showed up, the mouth of the cave was dry, and almost halfway up into the cave was still dry. After about 12 hours or so, they said, okay, we haven't had much success in finding, where these kids might be. So let's bring in or let's formally request that the Thai military and government get involved, is what the local community did. They also knew of a guy. His name's Vernon Unsworth. You can see him in the picture there. He just goes by Vern. He's a real nice guy, and his hobby is just caving, not cave diving, but caving, and he is obsessed with this cave. And he actually really helped us in the first few days with gathering intelligence about if they could be alive, right? Because the biggest question was, well, if they're in there, they're definitely probably dead, and we're just going to be a body recovery. But he was able to provide us spots that he said, no, there's high areas in the cave where if it flooded, they could scamper up the side and possibly be alive. And so that was also really good information, and just, gathering a lot of the facts initially. So he was living in Chiang Mai at the time, and he showed up with some of the local volunteers, and he began to go into the cave himself. And he was the one that actually told us that he had made it back to where that T-junction was, and that's where the flooding was, and they weren't able to go past there. But right prior to that T-junction is where they found some of the boys' sandals and backpacks, which even further confirmed that they had gone in that far and that they had taken a left and not a right, because those were some of the real big pieces of information that we were trying to find out initially. So fast forward another 24, it's the 25th of June now, and there's a group of Royal Thai Navy SEALs that have been flown up from Pattaya Beach. That's where they're stationed out of. And they initially kind of established a little operations center at the front. They link up with Vern, and Vern says, yeah, I think I know, but you guys are going to probably have to dive. And so they initially bring back just a few sets of tanks to where they think the dive entrance point is, but it's really difficult initially because you're having to kind of crawl and walk through spaces with all this equipment, sometimes on all fours, to get through these areas. And it's not just like a few hundred meters, it's like, a good half mile, 3/4 of a mile that you're having to do this. And as you'll see by some of these images that I have later on from inside the cave, it's not just these small restricted areas, but there's these real big, large, cavernous 50 and 70 foot chambers that you have to navigate your way through that are pretty steep and covered in limestone, and they're all wet. So trying to carry stuff over that was proved to be difficult. But they established a base center. They ran kind of almost like World War II style phones, and that was the only thing that worked. Like, believe it or not, we have all this really high technology for communications. We can talk with satellites to another person around the world. Nothing worked in that cave except for a thin wire that you would wind this phone up and it would work, and that was the only thing that worked, and it was waterproof. And so they had kind of established one at the T-junction initially, and then one at where we call Chamber 3, and that was the only means of communication. So it was literally a piece of equipment from 70 years ago that actually helped us to have some situational awareness, or them initially. But during this time, those initial monsoon rains that started early in June versus July were still falling pretty hard. And so as they were trying to work, they were starting to battle the floodwaters that had been slowly filling up the cave. And a good analogy that was told to me was, This type of cave is like a sponge where you can continue to pour water on it and pour water on it, and then eventually when the thing is completely saturated, any more water that gets dumped is going to come flying out the bottom of it, and that's basically what happened. Was for days and days it was just dumping rain, and not just at the cave, but 20-30 miles north, up in Burma, and a lot of these valleys, it was filtering down into this cave system. So the Thai SEALs were basically battling against the rains, and what had happened to them is as they established that base camp, the cave kept getting flooded and pushing them back. So a lot of the equipment that they brought in, they just left, which proved to be a problem later on. So they had pumps that they brought in, they had brought in wire, they had brought in a generator, believe it or not, a small generator to try to help refill the tanks, and all that got left in place, which proved to be a pretty big snag hazard when the cave was full of water. So the next day, this is where the waters in the cave are starting to get higher. He says, okay, Vern says this is going to be a dive mission, and the Thai SEALs have been trying to dive, but the problem is the flows of water were extremely high, so it was basically like trying to swim upstream of a flooded river. It's extremely difficult, even in like a 2-knot current. And so in some of the parts of the cave, they were just being very unsuccessful, and they weren't able to make progress. And the water was really cold, and it was completely muddy. So you basically, if you were to shut your eyes and and basically try to feel your way through, because like when I actually dove in for the first time, and I dove back to the chambers 2 and 3, I just remember thinking to myself, like, man, this is absolute chaos. Like, I can't believe that some of these guys do this for fun. Literally super dangerous and sketched, and you're literally just like every little thing's all feel, And oh, by the way, you can't breathe and you can't come up for air because you're way in a cave. But some of these guys like to do it for exploration, and they were huge members of the team. The 2 Brits that I'll talk about here in a minute that showed up, which are Rick Stanton and John Vlanton, as you can see there. So after the SEALs basically got pushed almost all the way out back to Chamber 2 by Tuesday, they sent this note out, and it went straight to the embassy, I think the British embassy in Bangkok, and they, through the Ministry of Tourism, were able to get these 2 guys, Rick and John, on a plane with another caver named Rob, and they arrived shortly prior to us. At that same time, the government reached out through the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which is in Hawaii, and said, hey, we are formally requesting the assistance of the U.S., and basically the admiral in Hawaii was like, okay, well, who do we have that could do this? And then, through liaisons and representation, they were like, yeah, there's a small team out of Kadena Air Base, Japan, that has the ability to do this, of Pararescueman combat controllers. So when the phone call came in for us, it was about 5:30 in the morning. It was like, hey, we don't have a lot of information, but there's some kids that are stuck in a cave, possibly a dive mission. And I just remember thinking to myself, okay, I didn't think that they were going to be alive. As soon as you think cave diving and kids, it's immediately, the worst things cross through your head. But I was like, well, even if it's like a recovery, and they need our help to do that, that's also what we're trained to do. So I had to, real quickly try to brainstorm, put together a team, and then try to get in any other, maps and imagery I could, and there just wasn't hardly anything on this cave. So the 27th, we actually arrived in Chiang Rai. It was nice. We got a nonstop flight on our own aircraft, the C-130, that took us straight from Kadena straight into Chiang Rai. We arrived at about 1 o'clock in the morning. So from phone call or from, hey, we need your assistance, to when we were at the cave was about 18 hours, which to me was pretty impressive, considering a lot of the bureaucracy that can happen with stuff like this, especially, getting overfly, that was something else. We had to get permission to overfly countries to go straight there versus take different routes. So all that was coordinated. There was 32 of us. That included our PJs, combat controllers, and our support team. And then, as you can see, about 5 hours before us, Rick and John arrived separately through commercial flights. So the 28th, as soon as we land, I sent the team to go get a little rest at the hotel, and I went straight to the cave site with Major Hodges and Jamie Brisbane, who was a prior cave diver prior to joining the Air Force, and we did kind of a site assessment. And I remember thinking to myself, it was pouring rain, and I was like, okay, just be ready for anything. And we go in, and it was really quiet. Obviously, it was 2 a.m, but I didn't see a whole lot of people doing much. It was just raining really hard, and there was a couple guys at the mouth of the cave, and they said, hey, we're the Thai SEALs, and we introduced ourselves, and we kind of said, okay, what have you guys done so far, and kind of what are your limitations? And they walked us in, and as they were walking us in, from chamber 1 to chamber 2, like 6 inches of water went over my feet, and then I was like, oh, this doesn't sound good, and you could hear more water coming. And then the SEALs that had been used to this the last few days were like, all right, yeah, we got to go. And within 2 hours of being there, the river, or I guess the water in the cave had risen 2 more feet, and now the entire mouth of the cave was flooded. And I was like, all right, this is going to be a problem. And I just remember thinking to myself, well, until I figure out exactly what's been done, I'm not going to, or we are not going to come in here and basically say, okay, you request our assistance, so we're going to take over. Key words for us were advise and assist, and that's what we were there to do. We weren't in charge. We were advising and assisting the Thais. And so, the SEALs ultimately told us, yeah, this is kind of where we're at. We were trying to dive. We were unsuccessful. We got pushed back. The rains were still falling. It's getting worse, and we're kind of running out of options. Hopefully you guys can show up and help us, and I think a lot of it was confidence in us, but they thought that we had equipment that didn't exist, which I'll talk about here in a second. Hollywood really does a number, I tell you.